Wife gave birth alone because her husband was with his mistress, which outraged everyone. The first contraction hit Clara Reynolds at 3:17 a.m., stealing her breath like a thief in the night. She gripped the edge of their king-sized bed, the silk sheets suddenly feeling foreign against her trembling fingers. The December wind rattled the windows of their Lincoln Park penthouse, but inside, the silence was deafening. "Michael," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. Her hand reached across the cold expanse of mattress where her husband should have been. Empty. Again. Another wave of pain crashed through her, stronger this time. Clara's breathing became shallow, panicked. This was it. 9 months of waiting, of dreaming, of planning the perfect moment when they would rush to Northwestern Memorial together, hand in hand, ready to welcome their first child. She fumbled for her phone on the nightstand, her wedding ring catching the light from the street lamps below. The screen showed dozens of missed calls from earlier that evening, all from her. Michael's contact photo smiled back at her, that charming grin that had won her heart 7 years ago, when he was just another ambitious energy consultant, and she was finishing her master's degree in art history. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hi, you've reached Michael Reynolds. I'm currently unavailable, but your call is important to me." Clara's heart sank as the voicemail clicked on. She tried again, her contractions now coming every 8 minutes. The automated message played again, that practiced professional tone that had built his empire but was abandoning her in her most vulnerable moment. "Michael, please," she spoke to the voicemail, her voice cracking. "The baby's coming. I'm scared. I need you here, now." She sent a text with shaking fingers. "Labor starting. Hospital now." The blue bubble sat there, unread. No response, no typing indicator, nothing. Clara pushed herself up from the bed, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other clutching her phone like a lifeline. The nursery door was open down the hall, the soft yellow walls they'd painted together 3 months ago now seeming to mock her solitude. The crib sat empty, waiting for a baby whose father might not even show up for the birth. She called her father Richard, knowing he would be awake. A lifetime of early mornings as a construction foreman had trained his body to wake before dawn. "Dad," she breathed into the phone when he answered on the first ring. "Clara, what's wrong, sweetheart? The baby's coming and Michael, he's not here. He's not answering his phone." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. Richard had never liked Michael, had always seen something calculating behind those charming smiles. But he'd held his tongue for Clara's happiness. "I'm coming to get you," her father said simply. "Don't you move. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Clara sank onto the nursery's gliding chair, the one Michael had assembled while she read him installation instructions. She remembered how he'd kissed her belly afterward, promising their child he'd be the best father in the world. Those words felt like broken glass now, cutting deeper with each unanswered call. Her phone buzzed. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. But it was just a notification from Instagram. Someone had tagged her in a story. Clara's blood turned to ice as she opened it. The image showed an elegant restaurant she didn't recognize, champagne glasses catching candlelight, and 2 silhouettes leaning close together. The timestamp read, 3:15 a.m., the exact moment her contractions had started. The location tag made her stomach drop. Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse, Rush Street. She knew that silhouette. She'd traced those shoulders with her fingers countless times. Michael. And beside him, partially hidden but unmistakable, was Natalie Hart. Clara recognized the distinctive vintage earrings she always wore, a signature piece that had caught Clara's attention at several company parties. Natalie's story caption appeared in elegant cursive, "With someone who truly values me." Clara's phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering to the hardwood floor. Another contraction ripped through her, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation crushing her chest. While she sat alone in their baby's nursery, calling for him, begging for him, Michael was clinking glasses with his mistress. The intercom buzzed from downstairs. Her father had arrived. Clara gathered what remained of her strength and her dignity, grabbed the hospital bag they'd packed together weeks ago, and took one last look at the nursery. Tomorrow she'd return with their child. But tonight she was learning that some promises were made of paper, dissolving at the first sign of rain. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Clara realized something that would change everything. She was about to become a mother. And mothers, she was discovering, had to be stronger than wives. The doors opened to reveal her father's weathered face, creased with concern and barely contained fury. He took one look at her, pale, shaking, clutching her phone with Michael's unanswered calls, and something shifted in his expression. "He's not coming, is he?" Richard asked quietly. Clara shook her head, unable to trust her voice. Her father's jaw tightened. "Then we'll do this without him. You're stronger than you know, Clara. And this baby is lucky to have you." As they drove through the empty Chicago streets toward the hospital, Clara felt something crystallizing inside her chest. Not just pain, transformation. She was about to give birth, not just to a child, but to a new version of herself, one who would never again wait for a call that would never come. Behind them, the penthouse grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Ahead, Northwestern Memorial Hospital glowed like a beacon in the darkness, where Clara Reynolds would discover exactly how much strength she possessed when the man she'd trusted with her heart chose someone else over the birth of their child. The contractions were getting stronger, time was running out, and Michael Reynolds was nowhere to be found. The fluorescent lights of Northwestern Memorial's labor and delivery ward buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Clara was wheeled through the corridors at 4:43 a.m. The wheelchair felt cold against her back, but not as cold as the empty space where Michael's hand should have been holding hers. "Room 314, announced the orderly, a kind-faced woman named Joyce, whose name tag had a small rainbow pin attached. "Don't worry, honey, you're in good hands now." Clara's father, Richard, walked beside the wheelchair, his work boots echoing against the polished floor. He'd called her mother from the car, but Janet was in Phoenix visiting Clara's sister and wouldn't make it back until tomorrow. Another absence in what was supposed to be the most important moment of Clara's life. "Has your husband been contacted?" asked Dr. Sarah Morrison, a petite woman in her 50s whose calm presence immediately put Clara at ease. She was reviewing Clara's chart as they entered the birthing suite. He's not available," Clara managed between contractions, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Richard's weathered hands clenched into fists. "He's not coming." Dr. Morrison looked up sharply, her experienced eyes reading the situation instantly. She'd delivered thousands of babies over 2 decades and had seen every kind of family drama. But something about Clara's quiet devastation and her father's protective anger made her pause. "I see," she said simply, making a note in the chart. "Well then, Clara, we'll make sure you have all the support you need right here." The next few hours blurred together in waves of pain and loneliness. Clara's phone lay silent on the bedside table, its black screen reflecting the overhead lights like a dark mirror. She'd stopped calling Michael after the 8th unanswered attempt, but her finger kept hovering over his contact, hope and desperation warring in her chest. At 6:15 a.m., her assigned nurse Emma Chen entered the room with fresh ice chips and a warm smile that didn't quite hide her curiosity about the absent husband. "How are we doing, Clara?" Emma asked, checking the fetal monitor. The baby's heartbeat filled the room with a steady, reassuring rhythm, the only constant Clara could count on. "The contractions are getting stronger," Clara whispered, gripping the bed rails. "But still no word from my husband." Emma exchanged a glance with Richard, who had positioned himself in the corner like a silent sentinel. His phone kept buzzing with calls from Michael's office, but he ignored them all. "You know," Emma said carefully, adjusting Clara's pillow, "I've been doing this for 12 years and I've learned that the people who show up are the ones who matter. Birth has a way of showing us who we can really count on." Another contraction hit, and Clara cried out, reaching desperately for something to hold on to. Emma immediately grasped her hand, her grip firm and steady. "Breathe with me," Emma coached. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. You're doing amazingly." Through the pain, Clara felt a strange comfort in this stranger's touch. Here was a hand that showed up, that stayed, that didn't promise, and then disappear when she needed it most. At 7:30 a.m., as Chicago began its morning rush, Clara's phone finally buzzed with a text message. Her heart leaped thinking it was Michael, but the message was from an unknown number. "Saw the Instagram story. So sorry. You deserve better. A friend." Clara's blood ran cold. Someone else had seen Natalie's post. Someone knew that while she was in labor, her husband was wine tasting with his mistress. The humiliation spread through her like poison, but underneath it, something else was growing. A fierce, protective anger for the child she was about to bring into the world. "Dad," she called weakly. Richard was at her side in an instant. "Check Instagram. Natalie Hart's story from last night." Richard fumbled with his reading glasses and Clara's phone. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then a rage so pure it seemed to heat the air around him. "That son of a—" he started, then caught himself, glancing at the nurses. "That piece of work was posting pictures while you were calling him?" Emma looked up from her charting, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "I'm sorry, did you say Instagram? Someone was posting on social media during your labor?" Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. Not just from the physical pain anymore, but from the complete devastation of realizing that her marriage, her family, her entire life had been built on lies. "Show me," Emma said quietly. Richard hesitated, but Clara nodded. Emma looked at the phone screen, her expression growing darker with each second. The timestamp on Natalie's story was clear, 3:15 a.m., the exact time Clara's contractions had started. "This is unconscionable," Emma breathed. "I need to step out for a moment." What Clara didn't know was that Emma had immediately shared the story with her colleagues at the nurses' station. Within minutes, it had spread through the maternity ward like wildfire. Nurses who had delivered countless babies, who had held the hands of frightened mothers and celebrated the joy of new life, were looking at evidence of a betrayal so callous it took their breath away. "Can you believe this?" whispered Tracy, another nurse. "While his wife is in labor, he's posting romantic dinners with his mistress." "The poor woman," added Dr. Morrison, who had just finished delivering twins in the next room. "She's been calling him all night, and he's been ignoring her to play house with his girlfriend." Back in room 314, Clara was approaching transition, the most intense phase of labor. Her body was preparing to bring new life into the world, but her heart was breaking with each passing minute of Michael's absence. At 8:45 a.m., another contraction hit with devastating force. Clara screamed, not just from physical pain but from the emotional agony of facing this moment alone. Emma was there instantly, one hand on Clara's shoulder, the other holding her trembling fingers. "You are not alone," Emma said fiercely. "Do you hear me? You are not alone. This baby is going to be born surrounded by people who showed up for both of you." Through her tears, Clara looked around the room. Her father stood guard by the window, his phone finally silent, having blocked all calls from Michael's number. Emma held her hand with the dedication of a soldier. Dr. Morrison moved with quiet efficiency, preparing for the delivery. Joyce, the orderly, had brought extra blankets and positioned herself near the door like a protective barrier. These weren't her family by blood or marriage, but they were her family by choice, by their choice to be present when it mattered most. At 9:17 a.m., Clara's phone buzzed one final time. A text from Michael. "In meeting. Everything okay?" The casual tone, the complete obliviousness, the assumption that everything would be fine while he prioritized everything else. It was the last straw. Clara looked at the message, then at the room full of people who had chosen to show up for her and her baby. She turned off the phone and handed it to her father. "I don't want to see it again until this is over," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all night. "This baby deserves to be born into love, not into waiting for someone who's never going to come." As if responding to her newfound resolve, another contraction built stronger and more purposeful than before. This time Clara didn't scream. She breathed through it, supported by hands that had chosen to hold her when the ones that should have mattered most had let her go. Outside in the hallway, the morning shift change was bringing fresh nurses who were quickly briefed on the situation in room 314. Word was spreading beyond the maternity ward now, carried by indignant staff who had never seen such blatant abandonment during one of life's most sacred moments. In a few hours, Clara Reynolds would become a mother, but she was already learning the most important lesson of parenthood. Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into, and sometimes the hands that hold you through the storm belong to people who barely know your name, but recognize your worth. The baby was coming, with or without Michael Reynolds, and Clara was beginning to realize that might be exactly how it should be. At 11:42 a.m. on December 15th, as the Chicago skyline glittered with winter sunlight, Clara Reynolds brought her son into the world with a primal scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The delivery room had transformed into something sacred, a circle of women who had chosen to witness this miracle. Dr. Morrison guided the baby's head with steady hands, while Emma counted through the final pushes. Joyce stood ready with warm blankets, and even the cleaning staff had quietly gathered near the doorway, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. "He's here," Dr. Morrison announced, lifting the slippery, crying infant into the morning light. "Clara, you did it. You did it completely on your own." The baby's first cry pierced the air like a declaration of independence. Clara collapsed back against the pillow, exhausted but victorious, tears streaming down her face as her son was placed on her chest. His tiny fist immediately grasped her finger with surprising strength. "Hello, beautiful boy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "I'm your mama. I'm here. I'll always be here." Richard stepped closer, his weathered face soft with wonder. "He's perfect, Clara. Absolutely perfect." The room buzzed with quiet activity as the medical team completed their procedures, but the atmosphere was different from other deliveries. Everyone moved with extra care, extra tenderness, as if they were protecting something precious from the cruelty that had already touched this new life. "What's his name?" Emma asked softly, cleaning the baby's face with gentle strokes. Clara looked down at her son, studying his features. She'd had a name picked out for months, James Michael Reynolds, after his father and grandfather. But as she looked at this perfect boy who had been born into abandonment, something shifted inside her chest. "James," she said firmly. "James Richard Reynolds." She looked at her father, whose eyes immediately filled with tears. After the man who showed up, Richard had to step outside for a moment, overcome with emotion. In the hallway, he found himself surrounded by a small crowd of hospital staff who had been following Clara's story throughout the night. Word had spread faster than wildfire through the building. "How are they?" asked Dr. Patricia Williams, head of pediatrics, who had come down specifically to check on the baby born to the woman whose husband had abandoned her for his mistress. "Perfect," Richard said, his voice thick. "Both of them are perfect, stronger than they know." Inside the room, Clara was attempting to breastfeed James when her phone, which she'd forgotten to keep off, buzzed insistently on the bedside table. Emma glanced at the screen. "It's someone named Michael," she said carefully. 17 missed calls in the last hour. Clara's stomach clenched. He knows. The timing was telling. For 12 hours, Michael Reynolds had been unreachable. Now, suddenly, he was desperately trying to contact her. Someone had clearly informed him that his wife had given birth, without him. "Do you want me to answer?" Emma asked. Before Clara could respond, they heard commotion in the hallway. Raised voices. The sound of someone arguing with security. Emma's eyes widened as she recognized the voice from the numerous voicemails Clara had played earlier. "That's him," Clara whispered, instinctively pulling James closer to her chest. The door burst open, and Michael Reynolds appeared, disheveled and frantic. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and he reeked of alcohol and expensive perfume that wasn't Clara's. Behind him, 2 security guards looked apologetic but determined. "Clara," he gasped, rushing toward the bed. "Thank God you're okay. I came as soon as I heard." "Stop." The word came out of Clara's mouth with such authority that everyone in the room froze. Even James seemed to quiet in her arms. "Don't come any closer." Michael halted, confusion flickering across his face. This wasn't the Clara he'd left behind, the accommodating wife who made excuses for his absences and believed his convenient lies. "Sweetheart, I know you're upset, but I can explain. The investors' dinner ran late, and my phone died and—" "Your phone died?" Clara's voice was dangerously quiet. "Your phone died at 3:15 a.m. while you were posting on Instagram?" The color drained from Michael's face. He hadn't realized that Natalie had tagged the location, that their romantic dinner had been documented for the world to see, time-stamped at the exact moment his wife went into labor. Emma stepped forward, her professional mask slipping slightly. "Mr. Reynolds, your wife has been in labor for 8 hours. She called you 17 times. We have the call logs. And while she was calling you," added Dr. Morrison, who had entered the room after finishing her notes, "you were apparently at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse posting romantic photos with another woman." The room fell silent except for James's soft breathing. Michael's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He'd built his fortune on quick thinking and smooth talking, but there was no spin for this, no corporate explanation that could justify abandoning your wife during the birth of your child. "That's not—" "It wasn't romantic," he stammered. "It was business. Natalie is a colleague." Natalie Hart posted a story at 3:15 a.m. with the caption, "With someone who truly values me," Richard said, speaking for the first time since Michael's arrival. His voice was deadly calm. "While my daughter was screaming your name and begging for you to come to the hospital." Michael's face went ashen. He looked around the room, seeing the barely contained disgust on every face. These weren't just medical professionals anymore. They were witnesses to his complete failure as a husband and father. "I want to see my son," he said, trying to regain some authority. Your son? Clara's laugh was sharp and bitter. This baby was born at 11:42 a.m. You arrived at 1:15 p.m. You missed his first breath, his first cry, his first everything. Emma here held my hand through transition. Joyce brought me ice chips. Dr. Morrison delivered him safely. My father counted through contractions with me. Her voice grew stronger with each word. Where exactly were you when your son needed his father? Michael couldn't answer, because they all knew where he'd been. The evidence was documented, time-stamped, posted for the world to see. I made a mistake, he said finally, his voice small. But I'm here now. We can work through this. No, Clara said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. We can't. Because this isn't a mistake, Michael. This is who you are. This is who you chose to be when it mattered most. She looked down at James, who was sleeping peacefully against her chest, blissfully unaware of the drama surrounding his entrance into the world. He's beautiful, Michael whispered, taking a step closer. Don't, Emma said sharply, moving to block his path. Clara, do you want him in this room? Clara looked at her husband, really looked at him. His expensive suit couldn't hide the guilt written across his face. His practiced charm couldn't undo the evidence of his betrayal. His wealth couldn't buy back the moments he'd stolen from their son's first day of life. I want you to leave, she said quietly. I want you to go back to Natalie, or to your office, or wherever you go when you don't want to be a husband or father. But I want you to leave my son and me alone. Clara, please. Security, Dr. Morrison called without hesitation. Mr. Reynolds is disturbing our patient's recovery. As the security guards moved to escort Michael out, he made one last desperate attempt. This is my son too, I have rights. Richard stepped forward, and for the first time since Michael had known him, Clara's father looked truly dangerous. You have the right to stay away, Richard said quietly. You have the right to explain to your colleagues why you missed your son's birth. You have the right to live with the fact that when your child needed you most, you chose someone else. But you don't have the right to upset my daughter one more second. As Michael was led from the room, still protesting weakly, a strange peace settled over the delivery suite. Clara looked around at the faces surrounding her. Emma, Dr. Morrison, Joyce, her father, and realized something profound. Her son had been born into truth, not the pretty lie she'd been living, but the honest reality of who would show up when it mattered. James would grow up knowing the difference between people who promised and people who delivered, between those who spoke love and those who lived it. He's going to be just fine, Emma said softly, adjusting James's blanket. Both of you are. For the first time in 12 hours, Clara smiled. A real smile, not the practiced one she'd worn through years of making excuses for Michael's absences. Yes, she said, kissing her son's forehead. We absolutely are. Outside in the hallway, the story was already spreading beyond the hospital walls. Nurses were texting friends. Doctors were sharing the tale with colleagues. Social media posts were being crafted about the woman who gave birth alone while her millionaire husband partied with his mistress. By evening, Goss and Clara Reynolds would be trending, and Michael Reynolds would discover that some reputations, once shattered, could never be fully repaired. But inside room 314, Clara held her son and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the people who mattered most. The truth had set her free, and James Richard Reynolds had been born into that freedom. 3 days after James Richard Reynolds entered the world, Clara sat in the hospital's family lounge, finally able to walk without wincing. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in golden light that made her son's sleeping face look angelic. She was supposed to be discharged that afternoon, but the thought of returning to the penthouse, to the nursery Michael had helped paint, to the bed where she'd called his name in vain, made her stomach clench. You don't have to go back there, her father said quietly, reading her expression with the intuition of someone who'd watched her struggle for years. Richard had barely left the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, standing guard like a sentinel against any further hurt. It's my home, Clara said, though the words felt hollow. No, Richard corrected. It's Michael's showcase. There's a difference. Before Clara could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, her expression troubled. In her 3 years at Northwestern Memorial, Emma had seen her share of family drama, but the Clara Reynolds situation had affected the entire staff in a way that surprised everyone. Clara, I need to talk to you about something, Emma said, sitting down across from them. The story, it's gotten out. Beyond the hospital, I mean. Clara's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Emma pulled out her phone, her fingers hesitating over the screen. One of the nurses from pediatrics. Her sister works at Chicago Tribune. She heard about what happened and Emma showed Clara the phone screen. The headline read, "Millionaire abandons wife during childbirth for romantic dinner with mistress." Below it was a photo, not of Clara, thankfully, but of Michael and Natalie from that night at Gibson's, clearly pulled from Natalie's Instagram story. The timestamp was circled in red, 3:15 a.m. Beside it, a stock photo of Northwestern Memorial's labor and delivery wing. Clara's hands trembled as she read the first paragraph. While Clara Reynolds, 31, labored alone at Northwestern Memorial Hospital early Tuesday morning, her husband Michael Reynolds, 38, CEO of Reynolds Energy Solutions, was photographed dining intimately with colleague Natalie Hart, 27. Hospital staff report that Mrs. Reynolds called her husband repeatedly during labor, receiving no response as he posted romantic social media content with Hart. The baby was delivered at 11:42 a.m. with only medical staff and the patient's father present. "Oh, God," Clara whispered. "This is going to ruin him." "Good," Richard said flatly. Emma looked surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "Dad?" "No, Clara. He ruined himself. The Tribune didn't make him ignore your calls. They didn't make him choose another woman over his child's birth. They just reported what he chose to do." Emma's phone buzzed with notifications. "It's not just the Tribune," she said reluctantly. "It's everywhere. Local news, social media. People are sharing it with hashtags like Clara Strong and You Show Up for Your Family." Clara felt dizzy. She'd imagined confronting Michael privately, maybe divorcing quietly, rebuilding her life away from the spotlight. She'd never wanted to become a public symbol of abandonment and betrayal. "There's more," Emma continued gently. "Channel 7 News is downstairs. They want to interview you." "Absolutely not," Richard said immediately. But Clara was quiet, looking down at James sleeping peacefully in her arms. Her son, who had entered the world surrounded by strangers who cared more about his arrival than his own father did. Her son, who would grow up hearing this story whether she controlled the narrative or not. "What are they saying about me?" she asked. Emma scrolled through her phone. "Actually, they're saying you're brave. Look at this tweet from Chicago moms. Clara Reynolds shows us what real strength looks like. While her husband partied, she became a mother. Alone but not defeated. Clara Strong." Another notification popped up, then another. Emma's eyes widened as she read, "Clara, you're trending. Nationally." Meanwhile, across the city in his downtown office, Michael Reynolds was discovering the true cost of his choices. His assistant Bryce had been fielding calls all morning. Reporters, investors, board members, all wanting statements about the situation. Michael's phone buzzed incessantly. Text after text from business associates, friends, family members who had seen the news. His mother had called 4 times, leaving increasingly angry voicemails. His brother David had sent a simple message, "What the hell is wrong with you?" But it was the call from his biggest investor, Harrison Wade, that made Michael's world tilt off its axis. "Michael," Harrison's voice was ice cold. "I'm assuming you've seen the news." "Harrison, I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain why, while your wife was giving birth to your child, you were posting romantic photos with your mistress? Can you explain how that reflects on your character, your judgment, your fitness to run a company that bears your name?" Michael's mouth went dry. "It's personal business, Harrison. It doesn't affect—" "Everything affects business, Michael. Everything. Do you know what my wife said when she saw this story? She said, if he can abandon his own child, what else is he capable of abandoning? That's not the kind of man I trust with $50 million in clean energy investments." The line went dead. Back at the hospital, Clara was reading through the social media responses with growing amazement. Thousands of women were sharing their own stories of being let down by partners during crucial moments. Mothers who had given birth alone. Wives who had been abandoned during medical emergencies. The common thread was clear. Clara's story had given voice to a pain that many had suffered in silence. "Look at this one," Emma said, showing Clara a Facebook post. From a woman in Seattle. "My husband missed our daughter's birth because he was golfing. Said he'd make the next one. There wasn't a next one. Clara Reynolds is living proof that we don't need men who don't show up." Dr. Morrison appeared in the lounge, her expression thoughtful. "Clara, I've been practicing obstetrics for 22 years. I've delivered over 3,000 babies. And I've never seen anything quite like this. The media attention? Clara asked. No. The response. The way your story has resonated with people. I've had nurses from other hospitals calling to check on you. Patients asking if you're okay. There's something about your situation that has touched a nerve. Doctor? Morrison sat down, her voice gentle but firm. I think it's because you did something very rare in that delivery room. You didn't make excuses for him. You didn't minimize his absence. You held him accountable, publicly, when it mattered most. And people are responding to that honesty. Clara's phone rang. The caller ID showed her sister Lauren calling from Phoenix. Clara, oh my God, are you okay? I just saw the news and I'm booking a flight right now. Lauren, slow down, Clara said, though she couldn't help smiling at her sister's fierce loyalty. I can't believe Michael did this to you. I never liked him, you know that, but this is unconscionable. How are you holding up? Clara looked around the lounge, at her father's protective presence, at Emma's genuine concern, at Dr. Morrison's professional respect, at James sleeping peacefully despite the chaos surrounding his birth. I'm stronger than I thought I was, she said, and meant it. That afternoon, as Clara prepared for discharge, Emma brought her something unexpected, a folder filled with cards and letters. These started arriving this morning, Emma explained, from complete strangers, women who saw your story and wanted you to know you're not alone. Clara opened the first card. It was handmade with careful script. Dear Clara, you showed us what courage looks like. Your son is lucky to have a mother who chose truth over comfort. From a single mom in Milwaukee who sees herself in your strength. Another. Clara, my husband left me during cancer treatment. Seeing you stand up for yourself gives me hope that I can do the same. You're an inspiration. Card after card, letter after letter from women who had been abandoned, dismissed, or betrayed during their most vulnerable moments. Clara wasn't just a new mother dealing with her husband's infidelity. She had become a symbol of refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. The reporter from Channel 7 is still downstairs, Emma said quietly. She says she'll wait as long as necessary. She wants to make sure your voice is heard, not just Michael's or the hospital's version of events. Clara looked down at James, who was awake now, staring at her with those deep blue eyes that looked nothing like Michael's. Her son deserved to know that his mother had chosen dignity over silence, truth over convenience. Okay, she said finally. I'll talk to her, but not about revenge or bitterness, about showing up, about being present for the people who count on you. As word spread through the hospital that Clara had agreed to the interview, staff members found excuses to walk past the family lounge. They wanted to witness this moment, when a woman who had been abandoned chose to speak her truth to the world, because they all knew they were watching history being made, not the kind that gets written in textbooks, but the kind that changes how people think about accountability, about showing up, about what it really means to love someone. Outside, the Chicago winter continued its relentless march toward Christmas. But inside Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Clara Reynolds was preparing to tell a story that would warm hearts and open eyes across the country. Michael Reynolds had made his choice that night at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse. Now Clara was making hers. And unlike her husband's decision, hers was being made in the full light of day, with her son in her arms, and the truth as her only weapon. At 4:30 p.m. on December 18th, Clara Reynolds sat in Northwestern Memorial's family conference room, holding 3-day-old James while facing Channel 7's veteran reporter, Miranda Walsh. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the exhaustion in Clara's eyes, but also something else, a quiet strength that hadn't been there 4 days ago. Miranda had covered Chicago news for 15 years, from corporate scandals to political corruption, but she'd never encountered a story that had generated such immediate and overwhelming public response. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop since the Clara Reynolds story broke, with viewers demanding more coverage, demanding justice, demanding that someone hold Michael Reynolds accountable. Before we begin, Miranda said gently, I want you to know that we've received over 3,000 messages of support for you since yesterday. Women from all 50 states wanting to share their own stories of abandonment, wanting to tell you that you're not alone. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't break. Instead, she looked down at James, who was sleeping peacefully despite the cameras and lights surrounding them. I never wanted this attention, Clara began, her voice steady. I never wanted to be the poster child for anything, but I realized yesterday that staying silent would be doing a disservice to my son, and to all the women who have been made to feel like their pain doesn't matter. Emma Chen stood quietly near the door, having insisted on staying for the interview. She'd become fiercely protective of Clara over the past 3 days, and she wanted to make sure no one pushed too hard or asked inappropriate questions. "Tell us what happened that night," Miranda said softly. Clara's voice remained calm as she recounted the timeline, the contractions starting at 3:17 a.m., the 17 unanswered calls, the discovery of Natalie's Instagram post, the birth without her husband present. But it was the way she told it that made the story so powerful, not with bitterness or hysteria, but with the quiet dignity of someone stating facts. "When I saw that Instagram post," Clara said, "I realized I had been living in a fantasy. I had been making excuses for someone who didn't deserve them. My son was about to be born, and I could either bring him into that fantasy or into the truth." "What did you think when your husband finally arrived at the hospital?" Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. "I felt nothing. Not anger, not relief, not even disappointment. Just nothing. Because by then, I understood that his presence or absence didn't change who I was or what I was capable of. I had already become a mother. I had already done the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life, and I had done it surrounded by people who chose to show up." She looked directly into the camera. "Emma Chen, my nurse, held my hand through transition. Dr. Sarah Morrison delivered my son with skill and compassion. Joyce Williams brought me ice chips and warm blankets. My father counted contractions with me and never left my side. These people didn't know me before that night, but they understood something fundamental. When someone needs you, you show up." Meanwhile, across the city, Michael Reynolds was watching the interview from his office, surrounded by crisis management consultants who had been hastily hired to control the damage. The board of directors was meeting in an emergency session down the hall, and Michael's phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from investors threatening to pull funding. On screen, Clara continued with devastating calm. "I want to be very clear about something. This isn't about revenge or public humiliation. This is about accountability. When you make promises to someone, when you vow to be there in sickness and health, in joy and sorrow, those words have to mean something. Actions have consequences." "What would you say to other women who might be in similar situations?" Miranda asked. Clara's answer would be replayed millions of times over the following weeks. "I would say that you deserve better than promises that get broken when it's inconvenient to keep them. You deserve better than having to make excuses for someone else's choices. And you deserve to know that your pain matters, whether anyone else acknowledges it or not." The camera captured the moment perfectly, Clara holding James with complete confidence, speaking not as a victim, but as a woman who had discovered her own worth in the darkest moment of her marriage. "As for my husband," Clara continued, and Michael's crisis team collectively held their breath, "I hope he learned something from this. I hope he understands that being a father isn't about showing up for photo opportunities. It's about being present for the moments that matter, even when, especially when, no one is watching." The interview concluded with Clara standing at the hospital window, James in her arms, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "I'm not the same person who went into labor 3 days ago," she said quietly. "That woman would have forgiven him, made excuses for him, probably even apologized for being upset. But this woman, the mother of this beautiful boy, she knows better now." Within minutes of the interview airing, social media exploded. Clara Strong became the #1 trending topic nationally. The video was shared across every platform, with comments pouring in from women around the world. "This is what strength looks like. Clara Reynolds just taught my daughter more about self-respect than I ever could." Every man should watch this and ask himself, would I have shown up? But it wasn't just women responding. Fathers began sharing their own stories, about rushing to hospitals, about being present for their children's births, about understanding that some moments are sacred and irreplaceable. "I drove through a blizzard to make it to my son's birth." Michael Reynolds couldn't put down his wine glass. This interview should be required viewing for anyone thinking about becoming a parent. The response was so overwhelming that Channel 7 extended their evening news by 30 minutes to cover the social media reaction. Other networks picked up the story, and by midnight, Clara's interview was being discussed on national television. At Reynolds Energy Solutions, the board meeting had devolved into chaos. 3 major investors had already called to discuss reassessing their relationship with the company. The clean energy sector was particularly image-conscious, and Michael's behavior was antithetical to everything the industry claimed to represent about responsibility and sustainability. "This is a PR nightmare," said board member Patricia Holloway, scrolling through her phone. "The company's stock has dropped 12% since this morning. Our biggest client just canceled their contract renewal meeting." Board chairman Robert Chen, no relation to Emma, looked across the table at Michael with barely concealed disgust. "Michael, in 30 years of business, I have never seen anything like this. You've made our company a symbol of everything wrong with executive culture." Michael tried to salvage the situation. "It's personal business. It has nothing to do with the company's performance or capabilities. Everything has to do with character," interrupted board member David Kim. "If you can abandon your wife during childbirth, what happens when our company faces a real crisis? What happens when our employees need leadership? What happens when our investors need reassurance?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Meanwhile, Natalie Hart was discovering that being the other woman in a viral story came with its own consequences. Her Instagram account, once carefully curated to showcase her lifestyle and fashion sense, had become a target for thousands of angry comments. The romantic dinner that had seemed so perfect 3 days ago now looked callous and calculated to millions of viewers. Her employer, a prestigious marketing firm, had already called her into HR. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters wanting her side of the story. Former friends were posting thinly veiled criticisms on social media, distancing themselves from the scandal. But perhaps most devastating was the call from her mother, who had seen the interview and was furious. "Natalie, how could you do this? How could you participate in such cruelty? That poor woman gave birth alone while you were posting photos like some kind of trophy." Natalie tried to explain, to justify, to minimize, but the evidence was too clear. The timestamps told the whole story. Her Instagram post celebrating being with someone who truly values me had been published at the exact moment Clara Reynolds was calling desperately for her husband. Back at the hospital, Clara was reading through messages on her phone, hundreds of them from women sharing their own stories of abandonment and betrayal, thanking her for giving voice to their pain. One message particularly stood out from a nurse in Denver. "Clara, you probably don't remember me, but I was in nursing school with Emma Chen. She sent me your story. I want you to know that you've started something bigger than just your own healing. Women everywhere are talking about what it means to show up for each other. You've reminded us all that we deserve better." Emma, who was still at Clara's side, read the message over her shoulder. "You know what this means, don't you?" she said softly. "What?" "You've changed the conversation. It's not about what Michael did to you anymore. It's about what women everywhere are going to demand from the people in their lives. You've raised the bar." As the sun set over Chicago, casting the hospital room in golden light, Clara realized that Emma was right. The scared, abandoned woman who had gone into labor 3 days ago was gone. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, someone who refused to accept less than she deserved. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Lauren. "Just landed at O'Hare. Saw the interview on the plane. I'm so proud of you. See you in an hour." Another from her mother in Phoenix. "Coming home tomorrow. You are the strongest woman I know." And dozens more from friends, colleagues, even acquaintances she hadn't heard from in years, all saying the same thing. They had seen her speak her truth, and it had inspired them to examine the truths in their own lives. Outside, the media circus was growing. News vans lined the street. Reporters stood ready with cameras and microphones, hoping for another glimpse of the woman who had become a symbol of dignity in the face of betrayal. But Clara wasn't thinking about the cameras or the attention. She was looking at James, who had slept peacefully through his first media interview, completely unaware that his mother had just changed the national conversation about accountability, respect, and what it really means to show up for the people you love. The boy who had been born into abandonment was already teaching the world about the power of truth, simply by inspiring his mother to speak hers. And in boardrooms and living rooms across America, men and women were asking themselves a question that would echo for years to come. When it mattered most, would I have shown up? 2 weeks after the interview that made Clara Reynolds a household name, she stood in the kitchen of her father's modest Brookfield home, warming a bottle for James at 6:30 a.m. The morning routine had become sacred to her, these quiet moments before the world woke up, when it was just her and her son and the simple act of nurturing new life. The contrast couldn't have been starker. 2 weeks ago, she'd been living in a Lincoln Park penthouse with a view of Lake Michigan and a husband who valued appearances over presence. Now she was in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by participation trophies and college photographs, learning that home wasn't about square footage or marble countertops. It was about the people who showed up when you needed them most. "You're up early," Richard said, padding into the kitchen in his work clothes. Even though it was Saturday, he still maintained the routine of 40 years in construction. Up before dawn, coffee black, ready to face whatever the day brought. He's been sleeping better, Clara said, testing the bottle temperature on her wrist. Which means I've been sleeping better. First full night's rest I've had since... She paused, realizing she was about to say, since the birth, but the truth was more complicated. Since before I knew about Natalie, honestly. Richard poured his coffee and studied his daughter's face. The dark circles were fading, and there was something in her expression he hadn't seen in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but the deeper satisfaction that came from living in alignment with your values. Any word from the lawyers? He asked. Clara nodded, settling James into his high chair. Michael's attorney called yesterday. They want to discuss arrangements for James. Supervised visits, they said, as if I'm the one who can't be trusted. What did you tell them? That I'm willing to discuss what's best for James, but I won't be railroaded into anything. Not anymore. Clara's voice carried a firmness that would have surprised her former self. I also told them that any visits will be here, with supervision, and absolutely no cameras or media present. The interview had continued to generate responses. Clara's phone still buzzed constantly with interview requests, book deal offers, and speaking engagement invitations. A major publishing house had reached out about a memoir. 3 different production companies wanted to option her story for a television movie. She'd turned them all down. This isn't about fame, she'd told Miranda Walsh when the reporter called to check in. It's about James having a normal childhood, despite the circumstances of his birth. But while Clara was choosing privacy, the consequences of Michael's actions continued to unfold in very public ways. Reynolds Energy Solutions had lost 4 major contracts in 10 days. The board of directors had voted to remove Michael as CEO, offering him a consulting position that everyone understood was corporate code for, please disappear quietly. The company's stock had stabilized only after announcing that Michael would no longer be the public face of the organization. Michael himself had become a cautionary tale in business circles. Executive leadership seminars were using his story as an example of how personal character affected professional credibility. Harvard Business School had added his case to their ethics curriculum. The man who had built his reputation on being a reliable partner in sustainable energy was now synonymous with abandonment and broken promises. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was happening right now, as Michael sat in his lawyer's office on LaSalle Street, staring at divorce papers that laid out the reality of his choices in stark legal language. She's asking for primary custody, his attorney Marcus Webb explained. Supervised visits for you initially with the possibility of expanded time if you complete parenting classes and counseling. Parenting classes? Michael's voice cracked. I'm his father. Michael, Marcus said gently. You missed his birth to be with another woman. The court isn't going to ignore that, especially with the level of public attention this case has received. Judge Patterson specifically requested all the media coverage as part of the case file. Michael's hands trembled as he read through Clara's demands. She wasn't asking for excessive alimony. In fact, her requests were remarkably reasonable. But the custody arrangement made it clear that she no longer trusted him to put James's needs first. What about the house? Michael asked. She doesn't want it. She's asking for a cash settlement instead, enough to buy something modest for her and James. She specifically stated she doesn't want to maintain the lifestyle you provided if it came with the cost of your presence. The words hit Michael like physical blows. Even in divorce, Clara was choosing authenticity over comfort, truth over convenience. Meanwhile, across town, Natalie Hart was discovering that being the other woman in a viral story had made her unemployable in Chicago's tight-knit professional community. Her marketing firm had restructured her position after losing 3 clients who specifically cited her involvement in the Reynolds scandal as a concern about the company's judgment. Image is everything in our business, her former boss had explained during the termination meeting. And unfortunately, your image has become toxic to our brand. Natalie's personal life had crumbled just as quickly. Friends had stopped including her in group chats and social gatherings. Her Instagram followers had dropped from 15,000 to 3,000, with the remaining comments ranging from supportive to scathing. Dating had become impossible. Any potential partner who Googled her name immediately found thousands of articles about her role in abandoning a woman during childbirth. She'd tried to rebuild her narrative, posting carefully crafted content about growth and learning from mistakes. But the internet had already decided who she was, the woman who celebrated while Clara Reynolds gave birth alone. This morning, Natalie was packing boxes in her River North apartment, preparing to move back to Minneapolis with her parents, a retreat she'd sworn she'd never make when she moved to Chicago 5 years ago. Full of ambition and dreams of making it big in the marketing world, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Dad has the guest room ready. We'll get through this together. Sometimes coming home is the only way to move forward." But as Natalie folded clothes that had once seemed so sophisticated and powerful, she couldn't shake the image of Clara holding James during that interview. Calm, dignified, unbroken, despite everything that had been done to her. Natalie had thought she was winning something when she posted that Instagram story. Now she understood she had lost everything that mattered. Back in Brookfield, Clara was preparing for her first public appearance since the interview. The local library had invited her to speak at their monthly women's book club, not about her story, but about her graduate work in art history. It was exactly the kind of normal, meaningful engagement she wanted to rebuild her life around. "You sure you're ready for this?" her sister Lauren asked, adjusting James's car seat in the back of Clara's modest Honda, a car she'd bought with her own savings, rejecting Michael's offer to maintain the BMW lease. "I need to start somewhere," Clara said, "and I want James to see his mother as someone who contributes to the world, not just someone who survived a scandal." The library was packed when they arrived, with women ranging from their 20s to their 70s, crowding into the community room. Clara had expected maybe a dozen people for a discussion of Renaissance art patronage. Instead, she found nearly 50 women waiting to hear her speak. But they didn't ask about Michael or the divorce or the media attention. Instead, they asked thoughtful questions about how art reflected the social values of different eras, about the women who had supported artists throughout history, about the power of creativity to transform pain into beauty. "You know," said Margaret Chen, an elderly woman who had been coming to book club for 30 years, "art history is really just the study of how people choose to remember what matters to them. Your story, the real story, not what the media makes of it, is about choosing to remember that showing up matters more than showing off." After the discussion, women approached Clara one by one, not for selfies or autographs, but to share their own quiet stories of strength, of choosing truth over comfort, of finding dignity in difficult circumstances. "Thank you for reminding us that we don't have to accept unacceptable behavior," said a young mother holding her toddler's hand. "My daughter is going to grow up knowing that her worth isn't negotiable." As Clara drove home that evening, James sleeping peacefully in his car seat, she realized that this was the life she wanted to build. One conversation at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. Not in response to what Michael had done, but in service of who she and James were becoming. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma Chen. "Saw the photos from your library talk online. You look radiant. That's what healing looks like." Another from Dr. Morrison. "Patient of mine saw you speak today. Said you talked about art like it was hope made visible. Thought you should know you're still delivering miracles, just in a different way now." Clara smiled, pulling into her father's driveway. The porch light was on, Richard's way of saying welcome home without making a fuss about it. Through the kitchen window she could see him washing dishes, probably having saved her dinner even though she'd told him not to wait up. This wasn't the life she'd planned when she married Michael Reynolds 7 years ago. It was smaller, quieter, less Instagram-worthy than the penthouse existence she'd left behind. But as she lifted sleeping James from his car seat and carried him toward the warm glow of her father's kitchen, Clara understood something that success and status had never taught her. Home wasn't a place you arrived at. It was something you built with people who showed up day after day without being asked. And in that understanding, she found something Michael's money and promises had never provided: the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the people who mattered most. The woman who had given birth alone was learning that she had never truly been alone at all. She had simply been surrounded by the wrong people. Now, finally, she was home. 6 weeks after James Richard Reynolds entered the world, his father finally met him properly. The court-mandated supervised visit was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a gray January afternoon at the Family Services Center on West Madison Street, a deliberately neutral location where strained families attempted to rebuild connections under the watchful eye of trained mediators. Clara arrived 15 minutes early, carrying James in the baby carrier that had become her constant companion. At 7 weeks old, he was alert and curious, his deep blue eyes taking in the world with the wonder of someone who had never known anything but love and security from the people around him. "Mrs. Reynolds?" The family services coordinator, Rebecca Martinez approached with a warm but professional smile. I'm Rebecca. I'll be supervising today's visit. How are you feeling? Nervous, Clara admitted, adjusting James's blanket. I want this to go well for James's sake, but I'm not sure Michael understands what being a father actually means. Rebecca nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed hundreds of these complicated family dynamics. That's exactly why we're here, to create a safe space for everyone to figure out what works best for the child. At exactly 2 p.m., Michael arrived. Clara barely recognized him. The confident, polished businessman who had built an energy empire had been replaced by someone who looked hollow and uncertain. His expensive suits had been traded for jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he wasn't sleeping well. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his hands shook slightly as he signed in at the reception desk. Michael, Rebecca greeted him. Thank you for being prompt. Are you ready to meet your son? The word meet hung in the air with uncomfortable accuracy. James was 6 weeks old, and this was truly the first time his father would hold him, talk to him, attempt to connect with him as a human being rather than a photo opportunity. They were led to a comfortable family room with toys, books, and child-sized furniture designed to feel as normal as possible despite the circumstances. Clara settled into an armchair with James, while Michael chose a spot on the couch that seemed carefully calculated to be close enough to show interest, but far enough away to avoid presuming intimacy. Would you like to hold him? Clara asked quietly. Michael's face went through a series of emotions. Longing, fear, shame, hope. Yes, if that's okay. Clara stood and approached slowly, giving Michael time to prepare. As she placed James in his father's arms, she watched Michael's face transform. For just a moment, the businessman disappeared entirely, replaced by a man experiencing wonder for the first time in years. He's so small, Michael whispered, his voice cracking. And perfect, look at his hands. James, who had been content in his mother's arms, immediately began to fuss in Michael's embrace. His tiny face scrunched up, and he let out the distinctive cry that Clara had learned to interpret as, "This doesn't feel right." He doesn't know me, Michael said, his voice breaking. My own son doesn't know me. Babies can sense tension, Rebecca explained gently, and they're very good at reading authenticity. James has spent his entire life with people who are genuinely present with him. It might take time for him to feel comfortable with someone new. The words stung, and Michael knew they were meant to. James continued to cry, his little fists waving as he searched for the familiar comfort of his mother's voice, her scent, her presence. After 2 minutes that felt like hours, Michael reluctantly handed him back to Clara. I'm sorry, he said, watching as James immediately calmed in Clara's arms. I don't know what I'm doing. That's why we're here, Rebecca said. To learn. Parenting isn't instinctual for everyone, especially when there hasn't been time to build a bond from birth. For the next 30 minutes, Rebecca guided Michael through basic interactions. How to support James's head, how to read his cues, how to speak to him in ways that promoted bonding rather than performance. But every attempt felt stilted and forced, like someone learning lines for a play they didn't really want to be in. Tell James about yourself, Rebecca suggested. Babies love to hear their parents' voices, even if they don't understand the words. Michael looked panicked. What should I say? Whatever feels natural, Clara said, though she immediately realized how loaded that suggestion was. Nothing about this situation felt natural to Michael. I run a company, Michael began awkwardly, then stopped. Well, I used to run a company. I developed clean energy solutions, solar panels, wind farms, things like that. He paused, looking at James as if expecting some reaction. I thought maybe you'd like that someday, helping the environment. James stared at him with the blank expression of an infant who was neither impressed nor interested in renewable energy portfolios. What else? Rebecca prompted. Michael struggled. I like golf and sailing. I have a boat. Had a boat. His voice grew smaller with each admission. I don't know what to tell him. I don't know how to talk to babies. Clara felt a mix of pity and frustration watching him fumble. This was the man who could command boardrooms, negotiate million-dollar deals, charm investors and clients. But faced with his own 7-week-old son, he was completely lost. Maybe tell him about the day he was born, Rebecca suggested. The room fell silent. Michael's face went white, and Clara's jaw tightened. Even Rebecca seemed to realize she'd stepped into dangerous territory. I wasn't there, Michael said quietly. I should have been, but I wasn't. "Where were you?" Rebecca asked, though Clara suspected she already knew the answer. The Reynolds case had been discussed in family services training sessions as an example of extreme parental abandonment. Michael looked at Clara, then at James, then at his hands. "I was having dinner with someone else. Someone who wasn't my wife. While Clara was calling me, needing me, I was—" He couldn't finish the sentence. James chose that moment to make one of his sweet baby sounds. A little coo that made Clara smile involuntarily. The contrast was stark. Life and joy and innocence in the arms of his mother, while his father confessed to the betrayal that had marked his entrance into the world. "I've ruined everything," Michael said, more to himself than to anyone else. "My marriage, my company, my relationship with my son before it even started. And for what? For someone who's not even in my life anymore?" Clara looked up sharply. "Natalie left?" Michael nodded miserably. 2 weeks after the interview aired, said she couldn't handle the pressure, the judgment. She moved back to Minnesota, changed her phone number. I haven't heard from her since. The irony was devastating. Michael had destroyed his family for a woman who had abandoned him the moment their relationship became inconvenient. He had chosen temporary pleasure over permanent love, and now he had neither. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Michael continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I want to learn how to be his father. If you'll let me." "If he'll let me." Clara studied her ex-husband's face, looking for signs of manipulation or performance. But all she saw was genuine brokenness, and perhaps for the first time since she'd known him, authentic humility. "Being a father isn't about what you deserve," she said finally. "It's about what James needs, and what he needs is consistency, reliability, and people who put his well-being before their own convenience." "I understand. Do you? Because showing up for this one visit doesn't erase missing his birth. Taking parenting classes doesn't undo choosing another woman over your family. This isn't about redemption, Michael. This is about whether you're capable of putting James first every time, even when it's hard or boring or inconvenient." Michael nodded, tears in his eyes. "I want to try. I know I have no right to ask, but I want to try to be the father he deserves." Rebecca made notes in her file. "We'll schedule weekly visits for the next month, then reassess based on how things progress. Mr. Reynolds, I'm also going to recommend continued counseling and a parenting skills workshop specifically designed for fathers who are rebuilding relationships with their children." As the visit concluded, Michael approached Clara one last time. "Thank you for this chance. I know you could have made it impossible for me to see him. I'm not doing this for you," Clara said clearly. "I'm doing it because someday James might ask why he doesn't know his father, and I want to be able to tell him that I gave you every opportunity to show up. What you do with those opportunities is up to you." Driving home through Chicago's winter streets, Clara reflected on the man she'd just left behind. The Michael who had charmed her 7 years ago, who had built a business empire through sheer force of will and charisma, had been revealed as someone fundamentally hollow when stripped of his external achievements. But perhaps that hollowness wasn't permanent. Perhaps losing everything, his company, his reputation, his family, would teach him what actually mattered. Or perhaps it wouldn't. And James would grow up knowing that his father was someone who only learned the value of presence after losing the privilege of it. James slept peacefully in his car seat, unaware of the complex adult drama surrounding his young life. He knew only that he was warm, fed, loved, and secure, the basic needs that every child deserved, and that Clara was determined to provide, regardless of who else showed up to help. As she pulled into her father's driveway, Clara made a silent promise to her son. She would give Michael every reasonable chance to become the father James deserved, but she would never again sacrifice James's stability for Michael's convenience, or confuse a man's potential with his actual behavior. Some lessons Clara had learned were too expensive to teach twice, and some promises, once broken during the most sacred moments of life, cast shadows that could take years to overcome, if they ever could be overcome at all. The question wasn't whether Michael Reynolds could become a good father. The question was whether he would choose to, consistently, when no one was watching and no cameras were rolling and there was nothing to gain except the quiet satisfaction of loving his child well. Time, Clara knew, would tell that story, and she would be watching. Clara smiled, looking out at the backyard where she could already picture James taking his first steps, learning to ride a bike, maybe helping her plant vegetables in the raised beds that the previous owners had carefully maintained. It was a future that looked nothing like the one she'd planned when she married Michael, but it felt more real, more authentic than any of those grand dreams had ever been. I'll take it, Clara said, surprising herself with the decisiveness in her voice. Dana raised an eyebrow. Don't you want to think about it, sleep on it? It's a big decision. I've been thinking about it for 3 months, Clara replied, shifting James to her other hip. He was 4 months old now, alert and social, charming everyone who met him with his ready smiles and curious expressions. This feels right. This feels like home. The paperwork would take a few weeks, but Clara had already mentally moved in. She'd been living with her father since James's birth, and while Richard had never made her feel unwelcome, she was ready to start the next chapter of their lives. The cottage was small but sturdy, affordable but charming, exactly what she needed to build a stable, authentic life for her son. As they drove back to her father's house, Clara's phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Martinez, the family services coordinator. Just wanted to update you on Michael's progress. He's completed the parenting workshop and has been consistent with his visits. James seems to be warming up to him slowly. How are you feeling about everything? Clara considered the question as she navigated through Oak Park's tree-lined streets. Michael had indeed been showing up for his weekly supervised visits, and she had to admit he was trying. He'd learned how to change diapers, how to prepare bottles, how to read James's cues for when he was tired or overstimulated. The desperate, panicked man from that first visit had been replaced by someone who was at least competent in the basics of infant care. But competence wasn't the same thing as connection. James tolerated his father's presence now, but there was none of the joy and recognition he showed when Clara, Richard, or even Emma Chen, who still visited regularly, entered the room. Michael was learning to be functional as a father, but he hadn't yet learned to be present in the way that mattered most. He's doing better, Clara texted back. But I can tell he's still performing rather than just being. James can sense it too. Rebecca's response came quickly. That's very perceptive. Authentic connection takes time, especially when there's been such a significant breach of trust. Keep being patient, you're doing everything right. Clara appreciated the validation, but she wasn't looking for praise for her parenting. She was simply trying to do what felt right for James day by day, decision by decision. And what felt right was creating a stable, honest environment where her son could grow up understanding that love was shown through actions, not words. That evening, as Clara fed James his bedtime bottle in her father's living room, Richard brought up a subject they'd been dancing around for weeks. You got a call today while you were out house hunting, he said, settling into his recliner with the careful movements of a man whose body bore the evidence of 40 years in construction. From someone at Northwestern Memorial. Dr. Morrison, I think. Clara looked up from James's peaceful face. Did she say what she wanted? Something about a speaking opportunity. A conference for healthcare professionals about family support during medical crises. She said they'd been getting requests for months to have you speak about your experience. Clara sighed. She'd been turning down speaking engagements, interview requests, and book deal offers for months now. The last thing she wanted was to become known as the woman who gave birth alone. She wanted to be known for who she was becoming, not what had been done to her. I told her you'd call her back, Richard continued. But Clara, maybe you should consider it. Not for the publicity or the money, but because your story is still helping people. Emma mentioned that they've seen changes in how partners behave during labor and delivery since your interview aired. Men are showing up differently, asking better questions, taking the process more seriously. Clara considered this as James finished his bottle and settled sleepily against her shoulder. She patted his back gently, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing that had become one of her favorite sounds in the world. Maybe, she said finally, but only if it's about supporting other families, not about relitigating what Michael did. I don't want to be defined by his failures for the rest of my life. That's exactly why you should consider it, Richard said. Show people that surviving something terrible isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of something better. Meanwhile, across town, Michael was discovering that rebuilding a life was infinitely harder than destroying one. His forced resignation from Reynolds Energy had left him with a substantial severance package and enough savings to live comfortably for years. But money couldn't buy back reputation or relationships. He'd moved from the Lincoln Park penthouse to a modest apartment in Lakeview, closer to his scheduled visits with James. The space was clean and functional but sterile, more like a hotel room than a home. He'd tried to make it baby-friendly for his visits, buying toys and books and a changing table, but everything felt performative rather than natural. His weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Angela Foster were slowly helping him understand the depth of his self-centeredness. but understanding and changing were two different things. He could intellectually grasp that he'd prioritized his own needs over his family's, but actually learning to think differently, to consider how his actions affected others before he took them, was proving to be much more difficult. "How did the visit go this week?" Dr. Foster asked during their Thursday afternoon session. "Better, I think," Michael said, though uncertainty colored his voice. "James didn't cry when I picked him up. He even smiled at me once, though Clara said he might have just been passing gas." "How did that make you feel?" "Hopeful, and then immediately guilty for feeling hopeful about something so small. Other fathers get to experience their children's first smiles, first laughs, first words. I'm celebrating the possibility that my son smiled at me instead of crying. That guilt is understandable," Dr. Foster said, "but it's also important to recognize progress. James is getting to know you slowly, which is exactly what should happen given the circumstances. The question is, are you getting to know him?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know how to answer that. When I'm with him, I'm so focused on not making mistakes, on following all the guidelines Clara and Rebecca have given me, that I'm not sure I'm actually seeing him as a person rather than a project. What would it look like to see him as a person?" "I don't know," Michael admitted. "Clara makes it look so natural. She just knows what he needs, what makes him happy, how to comfort him when he's upset. I feel like I'm following a manual for a machine I don't understand." Dr. Foster made a note. "Parenting is often about learning to be present rather than productive. Clara has had the advantage of being with James since birth, of building that connection naturally. You're having to build it intentionally, which is much harder, but not impossible. What if I can't? What if I'm just not capable of being the kind of father he deserves?" "Michael, the fact that you're asking that question suggests you're already becoming more self-aware than you were 4 months ago. The Michael who missed his son's birth wouldn't have worried about whether he was good enough. He would have assumed he was and blamed everyone else when things didn't work out." That evening, Michael sat in his apartment looking at photos of James that Clara had agreed to text him after each visit. In the images, his son was growing and changing rapidly, his face becoming more defined, his expressions more animated, his personality beginning to emerge. Michael realized he was documenting his child's development like a distant relative, rather than experiencing it as a father. He thought about calling Clara to ask for additional visits, but stopped himself. The boundaries she'd established weren't punishments. They were protections for James, and until Michael could prove he was safe to be around unsupervised, those boundaries were exactly what his son needed. The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman he'd betrayed during her most vulnerable moment was now protecting their child from the consequences of his choices. Clara was being the parent he should have been all along, putting James's needs first regardless of how inconvenient or uncomfortable it made things for the adults involved. As winter slowly gave way to spring in Chicago, Clara was learning that healing didn't happen on a schedule. Some days she felt strong and confident, ready to take on the world as a single mother building a new life. Other days she felt overwhelmed by the enormity of raising a child alone, making all the decisions, being the only parent James could truly count on. But even on the hard days, she never doubted that she'd made the right choice. Standing in her father's kitchen at midnight, warming a bottle for a fussy James, Clara felt more authentic and grounded than she ever had during her years of making excuses for Michael's absences. The cottage would be ready in 3 weeks. James was healthy and thriving. Her divorce was proceeding smoothly, with Michael's lawyers surprisingly accommodating about her reasonable requests. The media attention had mostly faded, allowing her to rebuild her privacy and sense of normalcy. Most importantly, Clara was discovering who she was when she wasn't defined by someone else's failures or successes. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, a woman with her own interests and goals and dreams. She was someone who showed up, for her son, for herself, for the people who mattered. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. 6 months after James's birth, Clara stood at the podium of the Palmer House Hilton's Grand Ballroom, looking out at 800 healthcare professionals who had gathered for the Midwest Family Medicine Conference. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was addressing the same medical community that had witnessed her story unfold, but now as an expert on resilience, rather than a symbol of abandonment. James, now a chubby, alert 6-month-old, sat contentedly in Emma Chen's arms in the front row. Emma had taken a personal day to attend Clara's first major speaking engagement, insisting that Clara needed friendly faces in the crowd. Dr. Morrison sat beside her, beaming with the pride of someone who had watched a patient transform pain into purpose. 6 months ago, Clara began, her voice steady and clear. I gave birth to my son in this city, surrounded by medical professionals who showed me what it means to truly show up for someone. I'm not here today to relitigate the circumstances of his birth, but to talk about what I learned in that delivery room about the power of authentic presence. The audience was completely silent, leaning forward to catch every word. Clara had initially declined dozens of speaking requests, but Dr. Morrison's invitation had been different. This wasn't about sensationalizing her story. It was about using her experience to improve how healthcare providers supported families during crisis moments. The nurses and doctors at Northwestern Memorial didn't just deliver my baby, Clara continued. They held space for my pain, my fear, my transformation. They didn't try to fix what was broken in my personal life. They simply ensured that my son entered the world surrounded by competence and compassion. In the audience, nurses exchanged glances with colleagues, recognizing the profound impact that their everyday actions could have on patients' lives. Clara's story had already changed protocols at several hospitals, with new emphasis on supporting patients whose families weren't present during critical moments. What I want to talk about today isn't medical technique. You're all far more qualified than I am in that area. I want to talk about presence, about the difference between being physically present and being emotionally available, about how your authentic care during someone's most vulnerable moments becomes part of their story forever. Clara looked down at James, who was now making happy babbling sounds at Emma. My son will grow up knowing that his first breath was witnessed by people who chose to be fully present for that moment. Not because they had to, but because they understood the sacredness of new life entering the world. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the audience. In contrast, he'll also grow up knowing that the person who should have been most invested in that moment chose to be elsewhere. That's a lesson about priorities that will shape how he thinks about reliability, commitment, and what it means to love someone. The presentation continued for 30 minutes, with Clara sharing insights about how healthcare providers could better support patients experiencing family crisis. She talked about the cards and letters she'd received from women who felt empowered to demand better treatment from their partners after seeing her interview. She discussed the responsibility that came with being present during people's most vulnerable moments. You see people at their absolute most raw, she concluded, when they're in pain, scared, bringing new life into the world, saying goodbye to loved ones. Your presence during those moments, your choice to be fully engaged rather than just professionally competent, that becomes part of their foundation for how they understand human kindness. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but what moved Clara most were the conversations afterward, as healthcare providers approached to share their own stories of supporting patients through family abandonment, of witnessing strength in unexpected places, of learning from their patients about resilience. That was extraordinary, said Dr. Patricia Williams, head of pediatrics at Northwestern, who had attended specifically to hear Clara speak. I've been delivering babies for 20 years, and I've never thought about our role quite that way, as witnesses to people's transformation moments. Emma approached with James, who immediately reached for his mother with a delighted squeal. You were amazing up there, she said, transferring the baby to Clara's arms. I had chills the entire time. And look, James was perfect the whole time. He knows his mama is doing important work. As Clara drove home to Oak Park that evening, the cottage had become officially theirs 2 weeks earlier. She reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying night when her contractions began. The woman who had called Michael's phone 17 times, desperate for his presence, had been replaced by someone who understood that true support came from people who chose to show up consistently, not just when it was convenient. The cottage felt like a sanctuary as she pulled into the driveway. It was small and modest, but every corner reflected her choices, her values, her vision for the life she wanted to build with James. The kitchen table where she fed him his bottles, the rocking chair in his nursery where she read him stories, the garden where she planned to teach him about growing things. All of it was authentic in a way the penthouse had never been. Her phone buzzed with texts as she settled James for his evening feeding. From Dr. Morrison. Heard your presentation was incredible. So proud of how you've transformed your experience into wisdom for others. From her sister Lauren. Dad sent me the video link. I'm crying happy tears. You're changing the world, one conversation at a time. From Miranda Walsh, the Channel 7 reporter. Saw clips from your medical conference speech. This is exactly the kind of platform your story deserves. You're making a real difference. But perhaps the most meaningful message came from Rebecca Martinez, the family services coordinator. Michael's therapist called today. She said your speech has been all he can talk about in their sessions. He's beginning to understand the depth of what he missed, not just the birth but the transformation moment. That's progress even if it's painful progress. Clara considered this as she burped James and prepared him for bed. Michael's weekly visits had continued, and she had to admit he was improving. He was more present with James, less focused on performing fatherhood, and more interested in simply being with his son. James had begun to recognize him, even smile when he arrived for visits. It wasn't the easy, natural bond that James had with Clara, Richard, or Emma, but it was something, a foundation that might, with time and consistency, grow into genuine connection. The doorbell rang just as Clara was putting James down in his crib. Through the peephole, she saw a delivery driver holding a large bouquet of flowers. The card read, "Thank you for showing all of us what strength looks like. From the labor and delivery team at Northwestern Memorial. 24 white roses, one for each hour of labor she'd endured alone, with a single red rose in the center." The symbolism wasn't lost on her, the white representing the purity of new life, the red representing the courage it had taken to face that moment with dignity. As Clara arranged the flowers in her kitchen, she thought about the life she was building. It wasn't the life she'd planned when she married Michael 7 years ago. It was smaller in some ways. No luxury cars, no designer clothes, no high society connections. But it was infinitely richer in the things that actually mattered. Authenticity, stability, genuine relationships built on mutual respect and reliability. Her phone rang, and she was surprised to see it was Michael calling outside of their usual scheduled communication times. "Clara, I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I heard about your speech today. How did you hear about it?" "Dr. Foster, my therapist, she attended. She said," Michael's voice was thick with emotion. "She said you talked about presence and what it means to really show up for someone. And I realized that I've never actually done that, have I? Even before Natalie, even in our marriage, I was always partially somewhere else." Clara was quiet, letting him continue. "I know I can't undo missing James's birth. I know I can't undo the years of not being fully present with you, but I want you to know that I'm trying to learn what that means. Real presence, not just showing up physically. Michael, I appreciate that. But this isn't about me anymore. This is about James and whether you can learn to be consistently present for him. I know, and I want to, not because the court requires it, not because I feel guilty, but because he deserves a father who shows up completely every time." After they hung up, Clara sat in her quiet living room, listening to James's peaceful breathing through the baby monitor. The conversation had surprised her, not because Michael was saying the right things, but because for the first time, he seemed to understand the depth of what he'd lost and what was required to rebuild it. Whether he could actually follow through remained to be seen. Clara had learned not to confuse understanding with change, potential with performance, but she was willing to let him try for James's sake, as long as he continued to respect the boundaries she'd established. The cottage creaked gently around her, settling into the evening quiet. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful, families finishing dinner, children being called in from play. The ordinary rhythm of life that Clara had craved during all those years of living in Michael's complicated, high-stakes world. She picked up one of the white roses from the bouquet and held it to her nose, breathing in its simple, clean fragrance. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman desperately calling her husband while in labor, begging him to witness the birth of their child. Tonight, she was a woman who had spoken to 800 healthcare professionals about the power of authentic presence, who had transformed her pain into purpose, her abandonment into advocacy. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been built through countless small choices: to tell the truth instead of making excuses, to demand respect instead of accepting neglect, to build a life based on her values rather than someone else's convenience. As she turned off the lights and headed upstairs to her own room, Clara realized something profound. She was no longer the woman who had given birth alone. She was the woman who had chosen to transform that solitude into strength, that abandonment into autonomy, that betrayal into a new beginning. And tomorrow she would wake up in her own home, with her son sleeping peacefully down the hall, ready to continue building the authentic life they both deserved. Not in reaction to what Michael had done, but in service to who they were becoming. Some stories, Clara understood now, began with endings, and some of the most beautiful chapters were written by people who had learned to author their own lives instead of waiting for someone else to show up and write them. December 15th, 1 year to the day after James Richard Reynolds entered the world, found Clara kneeling in her cottage garden, planting spring bulbs while her son played contentedly in the autumn leaves around her. At 13 months old, James was walking with the determined wobble of toddlerhood, his chubby hands grasping at everything within reach, his vocabulary expanding daily with words like Mama, Papa, for his grandfather Richard, and up. The garden had become Clara's meditation, a place where she could work with her hands while watching James explore the world around him. The previous owners had left behind established perennials, but Clara was adding her own touches: herbs for cooking, vegetables for teaching James about where food came from, flowers for the simple joy of beauty. Mama, flower! James pointed at the purple asters still blooming despite the late-season chill. That's right, sweetie. Purple flowers. Can you say purple? Purr, James attempted, which was close enough to earn enthusiastic praise and a kiss on his dirt-smudged cheek. This had become their Sunday morning ritual, gardening together, while Richard read the paper on the back porch, close enough to help but far enough away to let Clara parent without interference. He'd been spending more weekends at the cottage lately, officially to help with home maintenance, but really because he couldn't get enough of watching his grandson grow. Clara, Emma Chen's voice called from the front yard. She'd become a regular weekend visitor, and James lit up whenever he saw her, associating her with fun and attention and the same nurturing energy that had supported him during his first hours of life. Emmy, James shouted, abandoning his leaf pile to toddle toward the back gate as fast as his legs could carry him. Emma scooped him up, spinning him around while he giggled with delight. How's my favorite little man? Are you helping Mama in the garden? He's been very helpful, Clara said, brushing soil from her knees. He's particularly good at relocating the bulbs I've just planted. Emma laughed, settling James on her hip. I brought coffee from that place you like and something else. She held up an envelope with the Northwestern Memorial logo. Dr. Morrison asked me to deliver this personally. Clara opened the envelope curiously. Inside was a formal invitation on hospital letterhead. Northwestern Memorial Hospital cordially invites you to speak at our annual Gala for Excellence in Patient Care. Your presentation on authentic presence during family crises has been implemented in labor and delivery units across the Midwest. We would be honored to have you address our donors and staff about the lasting impact of compassionate care. They want me to speak at their gala? Clara asked, reading the invitation twice. Not just speak, Emma said with a grin. They want to present you with their inaugural Patient Advocacy Award for using your experience to improve care for other families. Clara felt a familiar mix of pride and humility. The speaking opportunities had continued throughout the year, always focused on healthcare improvement rather than personal drama. She'd addressed nursing schools, medical conferences, and family therapy workshops, sharing insights about what it meant to provide authentic support during crisis moments. But a formal award felt different, a recognition that she'd transformed her pain into something valuable for others. When is it? January 15th. Black tie. They'll cover travel and accommodation if you want to bring James and your dad. James chose that moment to reach for the invitation, crumpling one corner before Clara could rescue it. I think that's his vote, she laughed. As they settled on the back porch with coffee, Richard emerged from the house with his own news. Michael called while you were outside, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Richard had developed a working relationship with his former son-in-law over the past year, built on mutual respect for James's needs, rather than any personal forgiveness. What did he want? To confirm Christmas Eve dinner, and to ask if James could spend Christmas morning with him at his apartment. Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with any expansion of Michael's time with James. The supervised visits had progressed to unsupervised day visits, then overnight stays every other weekend. Michael had proven himself consistent and responsible over the past year, attending every scheduled visit, completing parenting classes, continuing therapy, and gradually building a genuine relationship with his son. But Christmas morning felt significant, the kind of holiday moment that became permanent memories. What do you think? Clara asked Emma, who had witnessed the entire journey of Michael's attempts at redemption. I think James lights up when he sees his dad now, Emma said honestly, and I think Michael has earned the chance to give his son Christmas morning. Not because he deserves it, but because James deserves to have both parents in his life if they're capable of being good for him. Clara nodded slowly. Michael had indeed transformed over the past year, though not in the dramatic Hollywood redemption way she might have expected. Instead, he'd become quietly reliable, showing up on time, prepared, and genuinely focused on James during their visits. He'd learned to read his son's moods, to comfort him when he was upset, to play in ways that made James laugh. More importantly, he'd stopped trying to win Clara back or justify his past behavior. His focus had shifted entirely to being the father James needed now, regardless of what he'd failed to be during those crucial early days. "Okay," Clara said, "Christmas morning. But here, not at his apartment. I want James to wake up in his own home." That evening, after Emma had left and James was asleep in his crib, Clara called Michael to discuss the Christmas arrangement. "Thank you," he said simply when she explained the conditions. "I know I don't have the right to ask for these opportunities. I'm grateful for each one. Michael, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Not just missing his birth, but all of it. The affair, the choices that led to losing your family." Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Every day," he said finally. "But I've learned in therapy that regret without change is just self-pity. What matters is whether I'm becoming someone worthy of the second chances you've given me. And are you? I hope so. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be. Not to win you back, I understand that ship has sailed, but to be the father James deserves and the co-parent you can trust." After they hung up, Clara sat in her living room, looking at the framed photos that lined her mantelpiece. James's first smile, his first steps, his first birthday party in this very room surrounded by the people who had shown up consistently throughout his young life. Emma, Richard, her sister Lauren, Dr. Morrison, even some of the nurses from Northwestern who had become genuine friends. There were no photos of Michael from James's first year. He'd missed too many milestones, arrived too late to too many moments. But there would be photos going forward, Clara realized. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings and school events where both parents would be present, if not together. It wasn't the intact family she'd dreamed of when she married Michael 7 years ago, but it was something more valuable. A functional family built on honesty rather than pretense, consistency rather than promises, respect rather than obligation. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Clara, this is Natalie Hart. I know I have no right to contact you, but I saw the article about your patient advocacy work. I wanted you to know that watching your strength from a distance has inspired me to get help for my own issues. I'm in therapy now, working on understanding why I made such destructive choices. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your dignity in the face of what we did has taught me something about who I want to become. I'm truly sorry for the pain I caused." Clara stared at the message for several minutes. She'd wondered occasionally what had happened to Natalie after she'd fled to Minnesota, but had never sought out information. The apology felt genuine, though it came too late to change anything that mattered. She typed back, "I appreciate you reaching out. I hope you find the healing you're looking for. Take care of yourself." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it wasn't cruelty either. Clara had learned that holding on to anger hurt her more than it hurt the people who had wronged her. Natalie would have to live with her choices for the rest of her life. That was consequence enough. As December 15th drew to a close, Clara performed her nightly ritual of checking on James before going to bed. He slept with the peaceful expression of a child who had never doubted that he was loved, protected, and valued. His nursery walls were decorated with photos of all the people who had celebrated his existence, a visual reminder that he was surrounded by authentic love. 1 year ago, Clara had been a woman desperately calling her husband while in labor, terrified of facing motherhood alone. Tonight, she was a woman who had discovered that being alone and being lonely were entirely different things. She'd built a life surrounded by people who chose to show up, who valued presence over performance, who understood that love was demonstrated through actions rather than words. The scared, abandoned woman who had given birth at Northwestern Memorial was gone. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, who demanded respect rather than accepting crumbs, who had transformed betrayal into wisdom and abandonment into advocacy. Some stories, Clara now understood, began with the worst thing that could happen to you. But the best stories, the ones worth living, were about what you chose to build from the wreckage, who you decided to become in response to disappointment, how you transformed your scars into sources of strength. As she turned off the lights and settled into her own bed, the first bed that had ever felt completely hers, Clara smiled at the realization that she was exactly where she belonged, not because someone else had chosen her, but because she had chosen herself, not because life had turned out as planned, but because she had learned to author her own story. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to show up for the people who mattered. But tonight in the cottage she had made into a home, with her son sleeping peacefully down the hall, Clara Reynolds rested in the quiet satisfaction of a life built on truth. She had given birth alone, but she had never truly been alone. She had been surrounded by love, from strangers who became friends, from family who showed their character under pressure, from a son who had taught her that some bonds are unbreakable, even when others prove fragile. And in that understanding, she found something Michael's wealth and promises had never provided, the unshakable peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. The woman who had cried alone in a hospital room was now the mother who would teach her son that showing up matters more than showing off, that presence is the greatest gift you can give another person, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of your life begin with what looks like an ending. Outside, Chicago settled into winter quiet. Inside, two hearts beat steadily in their respective rooms, mother and son, safe and loved and home. And that, Clara knew, was more than enough. It was everything. 5 years later, the Christmas tree in Clara's living room sparkled with handmade ornaments and twinkling lights, casting a warm glow over the scene that had become as traditional as it was precious. 6-year-old James sat cross-legged on the carpet, carefully arranging his toy trains while his 4-year-old sister Lily helped by moving the pieces to entirely different locations. "Lily, the station goes there," James explained, with the patience of an older brother who had learned that some battles weren't worth fighting. "But I like it here," Lily replied, her dark curls bouncing as she shook her head with the determined stubbornness she'd inherited from both sides of her family. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, marveling at the ordinary magic of the scene. 5 years ago, she could never have imagined this. A second child, a house full of laughter, the comfortable chaos of a family built on choice rather than circumstance. "Need any help in there?" David Chen called from the kitchen where he was putting the finishing touches on Christmas dinner. Clara's husband of 2 years still insisted on cooking for every family gathering, claiming it was the least he could do since Emma had introduced them at a hospital fundraiser 3 years ago. "Everything's perfect," Clara called back, meaning it in ways that had nothing to do with the meal. The front door opened with the familiar sound of Richard's key. He'd never given back the spare key from when Clara and James had lived with him, and she'd never asked for it. At 72, her father moved more slowly than he once had, but his weekly Sunday dinners with the family remained as reliable as sunrise. "Papa!" Both children shrieked, abandoning their toys to race toward their grandfather. "There are my troublemakers," Richard said, scooping them both into a hug that made them giggle. "Have you been good for your mama?" "James moved my train," Lily reported solemnly. "Lily moved my train first," James countered. "Sounds like you both need to learn about compromise," Richard said, settling into his favorite chair while the children climbed onto his lap. "Did I ever tell you about the time your mama and Aunt Lauren fought over a toy train when they were little?" As Richard launched into a story they'd all heard dozens of times, Clara felt that familiar wash of gratitude for the ordinary moments that had become extraordinary, simply because they were shared with people who chose to show up. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:00 p.m. Michael's timing had become impeccable over the years, part of the gradual earning of trust that had allowed him to become a consistent presence in his children's lives. Yes, children. Lily was David's biological daughter, but Michael had been part of her life since she was born, and she called him Papa Mike, with the casual affection of a child who had never known family drama, only family love. "Papa Mike!" Lily launched herself at Michael the moment Clara opened the door, while James followed with the slightly more reserved enthusiasm of a 6-year-old who was old enough to understand that his family was different from some others, but young enough not to care. "Merry Christmas, troublemakers," Michael said, lifting Lily while ruffling James's hair. "I hope you've been good because I might have brought presents." "We have," both children chorused, though Lily was already trying to peek into the gift bag Michael carried. Clara watched the interaction with the complex emotions that had never fully resolved. Michael had indeed become a good father, not perfect, but present and reliable and genuinely invested in his children's well-being. He attended school plays and soccer games, helped with homework, remembered birthdays and small preferences. James adored him, and Lily had never known him as anything other than a consistent, loving presence. But the shadow of his absence during James's birth had never fully disappeared. It lived in the way Clara automatically handled all medical emergencies, in her instinctive hesitation before trusting Michael with anything truly important. in the careful boundaries that protected her peace of mind even as they allowed for co-parenting cooperation. "Merry Christmas, Michael," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "David's made enough food for an army as usual." "Tell him I said thank you for including me," Michael replied, hanging up his coat. "I know these family dinners mean everything to the kids." It was one of the things Clara had learned to appreciate about the Michael who had emerged from years of therapy and hard-won self-awareness. He didn't take anything for granted anymore. He understood that his place in their lives was earned rather than owed, that his children's love was a gift rather than a guarantee. As the afternoon unfolded in the familiar rhythm of family gathering, too much food, competing conversations, children opening presents with wild enthusiasm while adults cleaned up wrapping paper, Clara found herself thinking about Emma Chen, who was spending Christmas with her own family in California, but who remained one of Clara's closest friends. Emma had been the first to point out that Clara's story wasn't really about betrayal or abandonment. "It's about recognition," she'd said during one of their monthly coffee dates. "You recognized who Michael actually was instead of who you hoped he could become. You recognized that James deserved better than excuses. You recognized your own worth. That recognition had transformed everything." Clara's speaking career had evolved into a consulting practice, helping hospitals and healthcare systems improve family support during crisis moments. She'd testified before legislative committees about patient rights. Her work had influenced policy changes in 3 states. But more importantly, that recognition had allowed her to build a life based on authentic choice rather than desperate hope. When she'd met David at the hospital fundraiser, she'd been able to love him for who he actually was rather than who she needed him to be. Their relationship had grown slowly, carefully, built on demonstrated compatibility rather than passionate promises. "Mama, look," Lily appeared at Clara's elbow, holding up a new doll that Michael had given her. "Papa Mike says her name is Hope." "That's a beautiful name," Clara said, lifting her daughter onto her lap. "Do you like her?" "I love her," Lily declared, "and I love Papa Mike, and I love Papa David, and I love Papa. She giggled at her own joke. Richard had become Papa to distinguish him from the other father figures in her life. "That's a lot of love," Clara said, kissing the top of Lily's curls. "There's enough," Lily said matter-of-factly, the wisdom of a 4-year-old who had never experienced scarcity of affection. As evening approached and the family gathering wound down, Clara found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching Michael play in the backyard with both children while David and Richard discussed baseball scores and Richard's latest construction project. The scene was peaceful, comfortable, unremarkable in the best possible way. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Merry Christmas. Hope your day is full of love and laughter. Thinking of you and remembering how far you've come since that night at Northwestern. You've built something beautiful, Clara." Another text from Dr. Morrison. "Saw your interview in healthcare today about trauma-informed family support. Your work is changing how we think about patient care. Merry Christmas to you and your beautiful family." And one more, surprisingly, from Miranda Walsh. 5 years ago today, I interviewed a woman who had just given birth alone. Today, that same woman is a nationally recognized advocate whose work has improved care for thousands of families. Your strength continues to inspire. Merry Christmas, Clara." Clara smiled, tucking her phone away. The media attention had faded years ago, but the work continued. Quieter now, more focused, but still driven by the same core understanding that presence was the greatest gift one person could give another. As she turned from the window, Clara caught sight of her reflection in the glass. The woman looking back was someone she barely recognized from 5 years ago. Confident, purposeful, at peace with herself and her choices. The desperate wife who had called Michael's phone 17 times while in labor was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love wasn't something you begged for. It was something you recognized when it showed up authentically. "Ready for bedtime stories?" David appeared beside her, sliding his arms around her waist in the easy intimacy of a partnership built on mutual respect and daily kindness. "Almost," Clara said, leaning back against his chest. "Just thinking about how different everything is now. Better different, honest different," Clara replied, which turns out to be the same thing. Later that night, after Michael had gone home, after the children were asleep, after David and Richard had finished loading the dishwasher and putting away leftovers, Clara stood in James's doorway, watching her son sleep. At 6 years old, he was all legs and arms and curious energy, but in sleep he still looked like the baby who had entered the world surrounded by strangers who chose to become family. The nightlight cast gentle shadows across his face, and Clara could see hints of both his parents in his features. Michael's determined chin, her own dark hair, expressions that belonged entirely to himself. He was growing up confident and loved, unaware that his birth story was anything unusual, secure in the knowledge that he was wanted and valued by everyone in his life. "Sweet dreams, my brave boy," Clara whispered, the same words she'd spoken to him every night since bringing him home from the hospital. As she settled into her own bed beside David, Clara reflected on the unexpected gift that Michael's betrayal had ultimately given her, the knowledge that she was strong enough to build a beautiful life from broken pieces, wise enough to recognize authentic love when it appeared, and brave enough to demand the respect she deserved. The woman who had given birth alone had learned that solitude and abandonment were completely different experiences. She had been abandoned by someone who should have shown up, but she had never truly been alone. She had been surrounded by love, from strangers who became friends, from family who revealed their character under pressure, from a son who had taught her that some bonds are unbreakable, and eventually from a husband who understood that presence was a choice made new every day. Some stories, Clara now knew, began with the worst betrayal imaginable, but the best stories, the ones that changed how you understood love itself, were about what you chose to build from that betrayal, who you decided to become in response to disappointment, how you transformed abandonment into the foundation for authentic connection. Outside, Chicago settled into the quiet of Christmas night. Inside, a family slept peacefully. Mother, father, children, and the grandfather whose spare key had never been needed, more than when Clara thought she had nowhere to go. The woman who had cried alone in a hospital delivery room was now the mother who would teach her children that showing up was a choice, that love was demonstrated through consistency rather than grand gestures, and that the most beautiful families were often the ones built by people who understood that presence was the greatest gift one human being could give another. In her dreams that night, Clara didn't revisit the pain of 5 years ago. Instead, she dreamed of the future, of birthday parties and graduations, of quiet Sunday mornings and loud holiday gatherings, of all the ordinary moments that would be made extraordinary simply because they would be shared with people who chose to show up, again and again for as long as love required. And in that dreaming she found the deepest truth of all, that some of life's most profound gifts came disguised as devastating losses, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters were written by women who had learned to author their own stories instead of waiting for someone else to show up and write them. The hands that had held her through transition, that had supported her through transformation, that had applauded her strength and witnessed her growth. Those hands had taught her that love wasn't something you convinced people to give you. Love was something you recognized when it arrived authentically, something you nurtured when it proved itself reliable, something you celebrated when it chose to stay. And Clara Reynolds, mother, wife, daughter, advocate, survivor, thriver, slept peacefully in the knowledge that she was surrounded by exactly that kind of love, held by exactly those kinds of hands. In the end, if you were Clara in this story, would you have given Michael a second chance to be James's father? Or are some betrayals unforgivable, even after years of genuine change? Tell us in the comments. What was the moment in the story that most impacted you, and why? I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like to help me out, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next stories. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.